evening to the Brexit Committee meeting of Monday the 19th of October. We'll start with any apologies. I have apologies here from Councillor Stephen Donnelly and Councillor Bert Wilson. Have we any other apologies from the group leaders? I'll start. Councillor Barry McElduff.
Chair, I think Barry sent apologies himself, maybe via Seamus if he's in, but I'm not aware of any other apologies from the group.
All right, thanks very much for that, Stephen. So Barry's an apology, that's fine. So go now to Councillor Victor Warrington.
Well, apart from Bert, I'm not aware of any others, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Councillor Earl Thompson.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Councillor Mark Buchanan and Councillor Deborah Erskine at this minute. Hopes to join later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Earl. Mary Garrity.
Thank you, Chair. No apologies from ourselves, but Councillor Coyle's running a bit late. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any apologies from the independents? No. So we'll carry on. The minutes of the previous meeting on the 15th of June, sorry to believe that the last meeting was held the 15th of June, have been signed. So moving on to declarations of interest. Nothing. So if members were permitted, we were going to move item 5.1, which was a presentation from Una Boyd from the Committee on the Administration of Justice, to come on now and move up the agenda slightly. That she'll do her presentation now, and we'll move then to matters arising afterwards. So welcome, Una, and thank you for joining us this evening, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much. Okay.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah, this is my first time using WebEx, so sorry if there's any technical difficulties. Thank you very much for asking me to join you this evening. We were contacted essentially to ask if we had any particular any developments related to Brexit that we thought would be of interest to the committee, and I think I'm not sure if it's already been sent around, but we have quite a detailed briefing note on what are essentially the rights issues that we see coming up as we come to the end of the transition period that we don't think have been fully addressed. So I'm going to try very quickly to go through those. And I suppose the position that we're in is it's nearly 2 months, before the end of the Brexit transition period. There do remain rights protection gaps, that haven't been addressed, and a lot of those seemed to be assumed that they would be addressed in the EU-UK future relationship negotiations. But it does seem like they have fallen off the agenda as we race towards the end of the transition period. I think there's a combination of reasons for that. The first being the completely understandable focus on the COVID-19 pandemic has just pushed a lot of other issues to the side. There's less resources, there's less time to focus on things. We've also noticed generally in the negotiations that there's a focus on business and trade, which is obviously very needed, but we are finding that gets more focus than, for example, human rights or citizens' rights. And also there does seem to be a bit of an attitude on some of these issues that they've been sorted, that the NI protocol's in place, and that we can sort of stop about, which we don't think is strictly accurate. So I'm going to run through this very quickly. I'll begin with what we call sort of paragraph 52 commitments. And that is essentially looking at the idea that you have Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland after Brexit won't be able to access most EU rights and benefits, barring sort of basic free movement. And that's something that was recognised. We saw the 2017 joint report. It made commitments to ensuring Irish citizens resident in Northern Ireland would be able to access those EU rights and benefits, and there were supposed to be negotiations that would put in place arrangements required in order for people to access those. And the rights that we're talking about there, it's very basic things sometimes, but it's things like student fees, EHIC cards, family reunion, access to EU programs like Erasmus. And unfortunately, those commitments that we saw, they just sort of vanished. We haven't seen them taken forward. There's no mention of them. There's no binding commitment to them in the withdrawal agreement or the protocol. There's no mention of them in the political declaration. The sole reference to it really is a sort of non-binding preamble to the NI protocol. And there's essentially just no, I think most of the assumption was that those things would come back and be dealt with in the negotiations, and they just don't seem to be on the table, which is a big concern. The second thing, just that there's growing concern over, is the European Convention on Human Rights. European Convention on Human Rights, its incorporation into NI law, it's a core component of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And this is something that's been continually affirmed by the UK government, and it's part of the withdrawal agreement, the NI protocol. But I think that the recent sort of actions by the UK government that everyone here is probably well aware of has really created a lot of concern about that. I think particularly things like the Internal Markets Bill. We saw that it explicitly, famously, we had the UK government saying they were going to be breaking international law, and it explicitly attempted to set aside international law, including the European Convention on Human Rights, when it came to aspects of the NI protocol. And even more concerningly, there was actually amendments to that bill that expressly limit the incorporation of the ECHR into NI law by trying to limit application of the Human Rights Act. And I think there's a real concern there, because the European Convention on Human Rights, that, as we said, is a core component of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and that includes getting access to courts and remedies for breach of the convention. And then we have the NI protocol, and it specifically in Article 2 says that there will be the UK government commits to no diminution of rights found under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as a result of the UK leaving the EU. And I suppose that when we see this legislation, this rhetoric coming out that appears to roll back on the European Convention on Human Rights, particularly when it impacts the NI protocol, what we're hearing from a lot of NGOs, a lot of organisations, is just that there's now a real trust has been really damaged, and there's a lot of concern about what else could be rolled back on, what else could be impacted by that. So thirdly, tying into that, it's the actual idea of the non-diminution of rights that you find in the NI protocol, and particularly the dedicated mechanisms that are meant to be there to enforce that. So just for anyone who's not aware, this is the Article 2 and Annex 1 of the NI protocol. And it's, again, as I just said, the UK government will ensure no diminution of rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity as found in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as a result of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. And the rights included in that are they're pretty broad. It includes, for example, the rights of women to full and equal participation in politics, rights to equality of opportunity in all social and economic activity, and the Annex 1 that's referred to actually contains a list of EU directives, EU equality directives, and those protect things like equality of opportunity between men and women in employment opportunities. A lot of the rights covered focus on anti-discrimination, and they're things that would be the real bedrock of rights and really, really crucial. As part of this commitment, the withdrawal agreement creates dedicated mechanisms, and that's giving powers to the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission in relation to monitoring that non-diminution commitment. And they're supposed to have this role to ensure compliance, and it's monitoring, reporting, I think advice, and they also have enforcement powers. And that's welcome, that's a positive thing. But our concern would be, first of all, that there's not been a very clear indication of whether the commissions will actually be given the resources and the funding needed to take on such a significant role. And secondly, to go back to what I previously said, where you have when you have rollbacks on the European Convention of Human Rights that impact the NI protocol, it undermines the role of the commissions if they're then supposed to be ensuring compliance with the non-diminution rights in the protocol. So that's definitely something that would and I would need kept on. One of the areas that I touched on in terms of people seem a little bit content to assume it's all sorted, and we would be a bit more concerned that there's still quite significant gaps in the rights protections is the common travel area. So I don't think anyone really talked about the common travel area that much before Brexit, maybe except for immigration lawyers, but it became a real buzzword for both the Irish and the British governments, you know, and we'll all have seen it where they keep saying, look, you don't need to worry about anything, common travel area rights, common travel area reciprocal rights, and they protect everything, life won't change because of common travel area rights. And our concern there is that it's not accurate. The common travel area, it's really a series of loose administrative arrangements. A huge amount of what we see as common travel area rights were essentially just covered by EU law when both the UK and Ireland joined the EU. And there's, I think it was the NI Human Rights Commission described the common travel area and any rights associated with it as written in sand. And they said there would need to be a treaty on common travel area rights to give them that security and enforceability. And we don't have that. There is some positive success in terms of the common travel area. You know, we have treaty and primary legislation, I think, on social security coordination. And we have a memorandum of understanding on the common travel area, but the memorandum of understanding is, I think it's about 4 pages long, and it says at the end that it's not a legally binding document. So that's really not enough, I would say, for people to be able to look at and point at and say, right, that's where my rights are codified and protected. And there's also a common travel area forum between the UK and Ireland, which is extremely secretive. We don't really know what's going on in there, what's being planned and decided. And we did ask, we FOI'd some of the terms of reference and documents, and we did get them, but unfortunately they were redacted to the point to be just complete black squares. So it's quite concerning that is such that there's no transparency there and that we don't know what's being planned whenever the government frequently refers to it as something that people can rely on and trust with. There's also a lot of people being, so for example, Irish citizens particularly are being told they can rely on the common travel area instead of applying to some of the immigration schemes that have come up post-Brexit, like the EU settlement scheme. And there's a concern there because people are being asked to make a choice between an immigration scheme and the common travel area, but there is no information on what their rights are under the common travel area, where they can find them, where they're protected. And we would say it's not appropriate to suggest people can make an informed choice. There's also on a sort of another side of the common travel area is how it impacts non-British and Irish citizens, because of course EU citizens, for example, living in border regions frequently use what we might associate as common travel area rights. And the post-Brexit, it's both governments are moving towards talking about the common travel area as something that's strictly restricted to British and Irish citizens. And it does seem like that's going to have a big impact on people who are used to using those rights and that they're actually going to be excluded from them. Northwest Migrants Forum in Derry have a brilliant campaign on this, where they would like to see common travel area provisions actually expanded to anyone who has permanent residence in the UK or Ireland. But instead of seeing that kind of modernisation of the common travel area, we're instead looking at it potentially being much more restrictive, and essentially what you'll have is a hard border for certain members of the community and not for others. Also within the common travel area, there's a serious issue regarding immigration checks. The common travel area, it's not a visa-free zone, but it is an immigration check-free zone. And in the UK, there's no immigration controls within the common travel area. In Ireland, the EU and Irish citizens are exempt from immigration checks. But what we've seen is that checks are carried out, and they're very frequently on quite a murky legal basis. often on the basis of quite blatant racial profiling, and sometimes we would find abuse of statutory powers where you would get, for example, terrorism legislation being used to conduct immigration checks because they know there is no immigration power to do so. That pre-existed Brexit, but the concern is that that will only increase. And we did get a commitment from the UK government that there will be no checks whatsoever on the land border. But when we asked for a similar commitment on routes between NI and Great Britain, they only responded that there would be no routine checks. And I think, those obviously they raise concerns about racial profiling, discrimination, but both any checks within the common travel area, there raise elements of a hard border, either on the land border or a border in the Irish Sea, which have broader impacts across both communities. Finally, just the sort of immigration post-Brexit is something that I think maybe is sneaking up on us and is something that definitely needs examined more carefully. What we're looking at post-Brexit is the biggest overhaul of the UK immigration system in decades, and a lot of it is going to have very particular impacts on Northern Ireland. And what we're finding is, unfortunately, the Immigration and Social Security Bill doesn't give us much detail on what the new immigration regime is going to be. Instead, it's going to be things passing through rapidly as statutory instruments, which means there isn't much time for engagement, impact assessment, and there's very little parliamentary scrutiny. And what we found is when we try to raise NI specific impacts with the Home Office, there's a real unwillingness to engage with it. And essentially it's a one-size-fits-all immigration regime for the whole of the UK. And a couple of really clear examples of this coming up that would hopefully be of interest to the Council. The first one is the Frontier Workers Scheme. The Frontier Workers legislation is going to be very similar to the EU settlement scheme that we already see for EU nationals, where EU citizens who are exercising their rights as frontier cross-border workers will apply to a scheme to retain those rights post-Brexit. We were asking for details about this scheme since, I think, about 2018. And unfortunately, we got very little. Any response from the Home Office always just said it would come in due course. And it was quite clear it's not a big concern in Westminster because there's not that many people getting the Eurostar over from France to London and back. But what we found very difficult was trying to put across how important this scheme is here in Northern Ireland. So many frontier workers and businesses are so reliant on them. The position we're in is that the Frontier Workers draft legislation was only published this month, less than 3 months before the end of the transition period. There was no public consultation. There was no assessment. The explanatory note, it confirms they have no idea how many people actually need to use the scheme. There's been no information campaign for businesses or employees. People aren't aware of the scheme. They don't know how it's going to work. And there's also been no extra funding in the pipeline for advice services here who are going to bear the brunt of helping people with that new application process. The second element that's come out of the new immigration regime that I think really reflects the impact here and how they're not being looked at is the immigration white paper refers to them bringing in electronic travel authorization. So that's going to be for people, visitors or transit passengers who don't currently need visas. So for example, EU nationals. And it's quite similar to what you would get when you travel to America, like the ESTA system, where you apply online for pre-entry sort of travel authorization. We put it to the government through a parliamentary question, sort of said that were they going to exclude, local journeys over the land border from this requirement? Because anyone could tell you that that's just not going to work if you have people who cross the border multiple times a day. To expect them to pay money, apply online for some pre-travel authorization to go get their petrol, it makes absolutely no sense in border regions. Unfortunately, the response was simply that they confirmed there would be no checks around the border, but that people would still be expected to comply with this. And that's a really, I would say, very unsatisfactory response. It puts people in a very murky kind of legal grey area. And yeah, it's, again, just very little consideration of the impact of these schemes. And And we have, I think today it was raised the impacts on specific impacts on business here in Northern Ireland. That came up in Westminster today. We're more reliant on EU on migrant workers than other parts of the UK. We are in direct competition with the EU, where people can move 40 minutes down the road and remain in the EU and working there. And businesses have said, that they're on their knees in terms of that direct competition. There's also, in terms of the broader immigration regime, a big concern where Northern Ireland will be the only part of the UK that still has a land border with the EU. All of the promises say there's no hard border there, there's going to be no infrastructure, but at the same time, we can see from the post-Brexit immigration regime, it's moving towards stricter controls, harsher sort of immigration regime than we currently have now. And how do those two things add up? And our concern would be that we're going to see a move to increasing in-country immigration controls and what are more commonly known as hostile environment measures in Northern Ireland as a way of creating a border when they can't have a border. And we've seen the impact that those hostile environment measures can have, most famously with Windrush, but even more recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there would be a huge concern that, particularly in border regions, that is just going to make cause a huge rollback on rights for all parts of the community. So as I said, that was a lot of information and a very quick run through. I suppose most of these issues could be summarised by saying that there's gaps and we simply aren't getting the focus on rights protections and human rights issues, and that things that are needed to sort of secure these before December. And I heard somebody refer to it as essentially like a vanishing tablecloth, where we know that when moved, things are going to come crashing down. At the minute, it's not clear exactly what those will be, but it does seem like a lot more preparation, a lot more work is needed now on the issues that we can see coming up on the horizon. We have a very detailed briefing note on this, which hopefully, if you don't have it, I can send round. And we also have more detailed briefing notes on specific issues like the dedicated mechanisms or frontier workers, if anyone's interested in sort of specific areas I've touched on. I didn't properly introduce myself, I've realised, but I run the immigration project at CIJ, so the immigration common travel area issues would be my specialism, but I am happy to try and answer any questions on the broader issues as well. If there's anything I can't answer, I'm happy to speak to my colleague and get back on it. So I'll maybe finish there, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much for that, Una. Your briefing paper has been circulated to the members, so they have it in front of them. So we have a number of members indicating they want to ask questions. So in order of, as they've come in to me here. So starting off with Councillor Emmett McAleer.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me all right. My internet's been a... Just thank you very much. And I think that's a lot of... Can you hear all right?
Yep.
Can you hear? Sorry. I'll maybe knock off the camera. Maybe it's...
Yeah, maybe knock off the camera.
So, thanks very much, Una, for the presentation. I think there's absolutely a lot of vitally important stuff still to be determined, and it's really very worrying because of the importance of a lot of it. As you had referred to, yeah, the human rights issue, and I suppose another angle kind of feeding off that is environmental rights, which I suppose I would be particularly concerned and interested in, as well as the human rights end of it. I'm just wondering, I suppose you've referenced maybe the Tory government and that their history or tradition on human rights mightn't be that well thought of, and I suppose even recently the spy cops bill that's progressing through Westminster is another kind of example of that. I just really wanting to know what your fears are or what your feelings are in terms of the potential loss of both human rights, workers' rights, and I suppose as well the environmental rights that are currently protected under European legislation. You know, could they be completely eradicated come January 1st? Or what's your feelings, what's your thoughts on that? Because, as I say, it's massively important stuff. Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball any more than the rest of us, but you know, would you have a fear that it could be worst case scenario come January or even come a bit later, 2021? What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, like I'd said, where we don't know where we're going to see gaps emerge, where we're going to see, a loss, and it's really, really hard to predict, as you'd said. But I don't think it's a case necessarily where we're going to see 1st of January, sudden huge changes, huge impacts. So, for example, workers' rights is a good example where I don't see there being a sudden change, sudden legislation. Well, I hope not any legislation brought in to significantly roll back on that. But what is concerning is the sort of slow rollback. And you've already seen, for example, from an immigration perspective, you've got EU citizens right now who are allowed to apply to the EU settlement scheme. They're going to have rights and protections through the withdrawal agreement, but that's welcome and that's a positive. But equally, we have currently the Home Office not confirming what will happen to people who, for example, can't apply to the settlement scheme, how hostile environment rights will protect them. We have confirmation that EU nationals post-Brexit from the 1st of January who arrive are going to be subject to an entirely new UK immigration regime. And it's slow rollbacks like that. And I suppose that when we look at the human rights, and particularly the European Convention of Human Rights, for Northern Ireland, what's particularly concerning there is that it is, a core component of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's explicit commitment, and it's then further committed to through the NI protocol, and it's difficult to see how the protocol can't be undermined if, therefore, the Human Rights Act, the European Convention of Human Rights, are undermined. And if the protocol is undermined, then of course that's a threat to the entire basis of the Brexit agreement. And yeah, in terms of things like environmental rights, it's again an interesting position for Northern Ireland because the protocol the annexes do contain specific sort of protections, specific directives are referred to. So I touched on the sort of equality and anti-discrimination directives that are referred to in Annex 1. And the idea of the protocol is that Northern Ireland will keep pace with those. And again, if the protocol is undermined, then it does seem a risk that those protections would also be undermined. So yeah, I suppose I would say that what we're hearing from a lot of NGOs is that the recent legislation, the recent sort of rhetoric coming out of Westminster has really damaged trust, and people are really concerned now about that just continuous rollback and that continuous undermining of what we have in place. But as you said, very hard to say how badly it could go, unfortunately.
Sorry, Chair, I think you're still muted there.
Sorry, thanks for that. Thanks for pointing that out to me, Emmett. Councillor Eamon Keenan is next up.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Una, for your report. Very good. Just one thing, that the legislation is already there that may lead to infringements of abuse of human rights. I think there's new legislation, and under the Counter-Terrorism Act, there's been a 1 mile wide stop and search zone established right across the border, and any examining officer can now stop any person under the new powers to detain them to see if they're hostile. With the amount of people living and working along the border, I think this is a real concern. I don't believe they've used it yet, but I'm sure as Brexit comes in and the amount of officers and checks happening, I think there's very real danger.
Yeah, and I touched on that briefly, but that's been something that the immigration project that I run has been focused on, which has been particularly checks happening on cross-border buses, and checks occurring particularly on people travelling in ferries between NI and Great Britain. And we've already quite commonly seen on the ferry journeys between here and Great Britain. So there's no immigration power to conduct immigration checks on those common travel area journeys. But what we see is the Home Office describe them as voluntary checks, where they stand and people show them their passports and answer questions. And it's very disingenuous because obviously most people, if you see someone in uniform, if they ask you questions, you will comply without necessarily knowing your rights or knowing, the basis for it. But what we did find is that sometimes when people refused, there's no statutory power for them to compel them to provide ID under immigration law, but instead what they do is they fall back on existing legislation. Like the really common one is Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, and they would use those powers, which are designed for very specific intelligence-led anti-terrorism policing, and instead they would use it to compel people to show their passport and then use that for the purposes of immigration enforcement. The other one they like to use is the Anti-Social Crime and Behaviour Act. There's a very specific law in that allows for false passports to be searched for. And it was initially designed because of the concern about people returning during the Syrian war, that there were people who had joined ISIS who would be returning to the UK on fake passports. So you can see it was designed for very policing, but instead we've seen posters up in, for example, I think it was Liverpool Ferryport, where it said Anti-Social Crime and Behaviour Act means you have to show your passport. And that's just, again, it's what's really concerning. I know you touched on the very specific legislation around the border. It is concerning that there is a history there of taking legislation that's designed for a very specific purpose and then using it in immigration checks. It's just clear abuse of a statutory power. And usually it's based on racial profiling and discrimination as well, just to add to that.
Yeah. That basically sums it up, yeah.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bert Wilson, your hand's up. Bert, you want to come in?
Yes, sorry, I was unmuted. I would welcome Una to the meeting, and I'm sorry I missed part of your presentation. You said about frontier workers, and I'm just wondering, that maybe will create quite a few jobs, hopefully. But what I was going to talk about was fisheries. Unfortunately, cheap imports of food could actually be coming into our area, and the quality of food that our farmers produce is really for top class. So we don't really want that. Unfortunately, I see some of our MPs voted to allow that to happen, and I'm just wondering. I know at this minute in time, we have a clue really what's happening. But, or at least from the ordinary 5-8, they don't anyway. Probably yourself would maybe, but I just know what your opinion is of the future for the agricultural and fishery and industry, and for jobs that maybe that Brexit will produce. So it's difficult to know for the like of an ordinary person.
Yeah, I'll hold my hands up that I don't have any specific expertise on sort of the more trade and business elements. My background is I'm an immigration solicitor, and obviously in CAJ we work on the broader sort of human rights and equality impacts. But I think what I can definitely speak to is the impact of the new immigration regime on things like agriculture and fisheries, because my understanding is that a lot of those industries really rely on migrant workers, and what we have is, as I touched on, you've got this one-size-fits-all UK immigration regime, and there was submissions made when it was being looked at that from Northern Ireland, where it was saying that we have specific needs, unique demographics, and there should be some flexibility for example, agriculture, for the needs of, and this was across the board, Scotland and Wales were making the same arguments. And unfortunately, the decision was to just go ahead with one regime for the entire of the UK. I think we will see that have a very specific impact here, with, especially as I said, we're in direct competition with the EU. And if you, for example, are an EU citizen currently working in agriculture in the north, and you have no idea what's happening. The frontier workers legislation has come out this month, but as far as we know, there's been no outreach. There's no reason an ordinary person will even know what that is. And if you know that you can move very short distance, remain in the EU, know your rights, know that you're going to be allowed to continue working, know that your kids are going to be allowed to continue going to school without any fuss. We've heard from quite a few border businesses, particularly, that they're just losing employees left, right, and centre because of that. And I would be really concerned that the new immigration regime doesn't reflect what's needed in Northern Ireland. And I think the most obvious one, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of, was the salary cap. There was huge debate around this, particularly from Scotland, where the salary cap is sort of just a blanket average, and it originally was set at 30 grand. And that would be, so for a basic sort of worker's visa, you would need to earn 30 grand a year. And that's obviously not a reality for so many jobs, particularly in devolved regions, particularly in, maybe it would be in London, but certainly not in Belfast. And it's now been reduced to 26,500. There are some exempt from that. But yeah, it's just a really good example of, this is the regime people are going to be looking at. This is the kind of, there's going to be much stricter requirements. Businesses that are used to relying on EU work aren't used to these kind of visa applications. They aren't used to sponsorship. It's extremely complex. And I would worry that we're going to see a lot of difficulty and a huge, quite a significant loss of migrant labour because of it.
Thanks, Una.
Thank you,
Councillor
Una.
Seamus Green.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Una.
Seamus and me would like 30,000 a year. Thanks.
I wish. Just on all of the things you went through there, it was really worrying. Una, I noted them down. People lose EU rights and benefits. The European Convention for Human Rights, the Good Friday Agreement, ANI Protocol, the diminution of human rights, the common travel area not legally binding. There doesn't seem to be any upside to Brexit at all, as some of us did try to point out at the time. But as an expert on the field that you're talking about tonight, can you see or give us any upside that you can see on this whole process? Because from where I'm coming from, I have been trying to figure out, is there any upside to it? And I can't get anybody to say that there is, but maybe you'll be the exception tonight. And just one other question, Una. Brexiteers seem to be quite anti-immigration. But can you confirm that this whole Brexit strategy that they had will have zero effect on immigration from the old empire countries, the old British Empire countries, as in the Commonwealth? This is just solely the European Union, this legislation, and this will all affect. So am I right in saying that Britain always had control of their borders if they had wanted in around the old empire countries?
So on the immigration issue, the major change that comes out of Brexit is the end of free movement, and that obviously only applies to EU nationals. And what we're seeing is that the EU nationals who weren't living in the UK before December this year will be brought under what is essentially the existing UK immigration regime that nationals from any countries outside the EU already have to go through. So the work visa is a good example, where if you are coming from America and want to apply to work in the UK, you go through a specific visa process. And EU nationals arriving after December are going to be treated in a similar way. That it'll essentially be one system for all immigration instead of what we used to see as the two parallel systems, where you had the EU immigration system and the UK immigration system. I think that a lot of the rhetoric around sort of controlling migration, controlling the borders, it really was because the EU migration it's quite broad, it's quite open. For example, an EU national can bring a family member as long as they're exercising treaty rights in another EU country, can bring their non-EU family members with them for free. You don't obviously have to apply for visas. You don't have to be earning a certain amount. You can just come. You can work. You can come self-employed, and it's really about getting rid of that parallel system and bringing everyone under the much stricter UK immigration regime. I don't know about whether it will reduce or increase immigration. I think certainly there doesn't seem to be any major changes proposed for the existing UK visa regime. There are some changes to work visas, but for example, the family visa system is so far there's been no changes proposed. I think we will see now that there's the pattern so far has been that the current Home Office really wants to reform the immigration regime, and I think we will see a lot of changes come through. But ultimately, the goal there in Brexit in terms of immigration was bringing EU nationals under that system. And yeah, it certainly doesn't. For example, we were seeing a lot of rhetoric around, asylum and refugee law, and it's quite disingenuous to suggest that is directly impacted by it. It's EU. It's not. It's EU nationals whose immigration status and immigration regime is the one that's changing significantly. In terms of positives from the changes and the developments we're seeing, I mean, I think the problem for us is that we're really focusing on the gaps. We're really trying to prevent people falling through the cracks. And what we keep saying is that there's so much discussion on trade, there's so much focus on business, and that is needed, that's essential, of course, but we're just really concerned that there's a lot of things that could be very easily solved. Things like, student fees, cross-border healthcare, it's in the power of both governments to come out with quite clear commitments in these and statements on these, but there's been a real, they just seem to come off the agenda. They're not being talked about. They're not being addressed. Even the EHIC card, there was a clear statement from the Irish government on that they were going to provide one for residents of Northern Ireland, but I think that's sort of vanished. Maybe I might be wrong, but I don't think I've seen that. Nothing's come out of it. There's no legislation. It was sort of just vanished into thin air. And, that's where we need, those would be the positives we need. We need to see where clear commitments can be made, where people can be assured. Those need to be done, and they need to be done very quickly. But yeah, and I suppose I'm going to try and pick out a positive because I'm aware of particularly my entire presentation being extremely negative. We have seen recently some moves by the UK government to actually comply with rights and expand rights, which is a positive. So the most famous one would be the D'Souza changes to the EU settlement scheme that we saw recently. They came into force on the 24th of August. And they're really significant because what they do is they actually opened up EU family reunion under the settlement scheme, not only to Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland, but to British and dual British and Irish citizens. And I think that's a really interesting precedent there, because it's, when we look at EU rights and EU benefits, often we're talking about Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland, but there's a precedent where we've seen if the Irish citizens are given the right to access an EU right, then for parity of esteem, the British citizens and dual British and Irish citizens also should be granted that right. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. I tried to be positive, but yeah, lots to be worried about, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, Una. Okay, Seamus. Councillor Bernice Swift.
And thank you very much, Una, for your detailed briefing paper. And I hear you loud and clear when you say it's that there's not much to be positive about. But we're dealing with the real world and the real situation, so we are aware of the adverse impacts that the UK withdrawal will bring on us, particularly in our border area here, and hence the raison d'etre to have a Brexit committee. So we're pretty well versed now at this stage of all the scary things that are likely to be facing us. But it is great to hear from CAJ on all of the issues that you've outlined. And it's not just about business that we're talking about either. I'm certainly very interested and keen on the whole broader human rights and equality impacts that you have very clearly outlined. I am concerned too about the Internal Markets Bill. I'm very concerned about those amendments which limit ECHR. That is very, very scary, particularly when we hear all parties constantly promoting the core components of the Good Friday Agreement. So those issues cannot be ignored, because they are enshrined also. And even though the UK government, of course, have the big say, they are in breach of a diminution of our rights. And that's what we are here now fighting for, to ensure that, unfortunately, the British rhetoric being at odds with what we want our rights to be. So to address all these issues, Una, and you have mentioned the Home Office on a couple of occasions, and I am aware that they've sent back information heavily redacted, which would lead us to believe that there's a lot of meetings taking place rather covert, and it doesn't imbue any confidence in us here in the border region whatsoever. I have recently requested to meet with the newly appointed part-time human rights commissioners on NIHRC along with Amnesty. Now, I'm just wondering, with your engagements with the Home Office, are there any joint up collaboration with NIHRC on any of this work? Really, are they doing anything to effect in any way significantly or meaningfully, particularly for our border area? I know you can't speak for them, but I'm just asking in terms of any collaboration. You have your own role at CAJ. Because again, you mentioned about the racial profiling, all of that's in blatant contravention and wholly unfair. And Eamon mentioned the issue about the whole terrorism act impacting a mile wide, and we here do not want to see a heavy militarized border again. There's some of us old enough to remember that, and we do not want to return to that. And you had mentioned the D'Souza case. And that was a prolonged and protracted issue to have to, get to a resolvable conclusion. So I'm just wondering, in terms of sending then, your reports, your briefing paper to the Home Office, and the need that we still have to have a treaty on the common travel area, rather than that, as you said, being written in sand, needs to be in concrete, and, to ensure the rights are enshrined. So I'm just wondering, where else has your briefing paper been sent to, our central government here? Is it having an impact? Are people listening? Are they voicing and raising the needs to have these rights enshrined? Is there anybody even doing a debriefing on a treaty? Those kind of things, because we here in Fermanagh and Omagh want to be proactive, and I would be suggesting that we too contact the Home Office to support your briefing paper, to ensure that we obtain everything that you have outlined. So just those few tips, please, Una. Guramagat, thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. We in terms of actual direct engagement with the Home Office, I think fairly notoriously they're a very difficult body of government to meet a human within, and we wouldn't, aside from, for example, letters to the Home Secretary, things like that, we wouldn't necessarily have direct engagement with them in terms of sending briefing notes, sending updates, sending queries. We have had recently a really positive development which came out of the changes to the settlement scheme related to D'Souza, and what we found there was that that scheme only came into force on the 24th of August. A lot of people need to apply before December. It's a really tight time scale, and it was just teething problems, huge amounts of issues coming up. And through engagement with the NIO and the Executive Office, we were able to make contact with the Home Office, who actually met with us, and they've been essentially responding to the queries we're sending through directly. We can then pass those on to practitioners and advisors, and that's been really positive. And I'm hoping that's maybe something we can build on to just keep that kind of communication going, but it is quite new. Our briefing notes, our sort of submissions, policy documents, things like that would go as far as we can get them, really. We've had really positive engagement with a lot of the MPs who are from Westminster, particularly across the board, including, for example, Labour SNP, but also the Northern Irish MPs have been very engaged, and they've been raising these issues in Parliament, and we've been able to use things like parliamentary questions to kind of tease out issues and get answers on things. We've also had really positive engagement from a lot of the departments in Stormont. So the sort of Department for the Economy, for example, are very abroad across the issues of things like frontier workers. We've the Northern Ireland office have really engaged with us a lot on some of the specific sort of NI protocol issues, the EU settlements commission, so the D'Souza issues, same with the Executive Office. It's I think there is there's good work being done, and there is engagement there, but I think the problem is that there's so much going on, and as I've said, a lot of these issues are they're just not top of the priority list, and it is concerning that time is passing by and they won't be dealt with. And when it comes to things like the common travel area, for example, the concerns there, we tried, for example, to put an amendment into the Immigration and Social Security Bill. We did that with the support of it was a Labour MP who tabled it. All that amendment asked for was that the UK government publish a document that set out common travel area rights, what they are, where you find them, how people can access them, and it wasn't successful. It didn't pass, and that's really concerning, because it is just a bit of a brick wall that you're hitting when you would consider these things quite reasonable asks. Same with the Frontier Workers Bill. We were saying, Frontier Workers Scheme, for years now. Organisations, not just ourselves, but Centre for Cross-Border Studies, unions, business representatives have been saying there's a frontier workers scheme mentioned in the withdrawal agreement. Can you tell us what it will be? How much will it cost? How do people apply to it? And there was just nothing, no information forthcoming until this month. And even that's a really good example where they didn't even do an impact assessment. They didn't meet with anyone. They don't even know how many frontier workers there are. Things like that do make you feel like there might be a real, it is a bit, again, that brick wall. In terms of the Human Rights Commission, they've been doing really brilliant work on this. And I think in our briefing paper, we've actually referenced a couple of the reports they've done recently. Particularly, there was one that examines in forensic detail the EU rights and benefits and the potential loss of them, and how that impacts all it's a really fantastic document. They've also done really specific work, for example, on the Internal Markets Bill, on the protection of the NI Protocol. We would work with the Human Rights Commission a lot, and I think they're really, really on top of this stuff. And hopefully, like we said, with the dedicated mechanisms, hopefully they get the support and the funding and to continue doing that, because it's really, really valuable.
Thank you very much, Una. Great to hear that. Thank you.
Thanks, Una. Councillor Seamus Green, your hand's still up if you want to take it down there. So the next question is Councillor John McClary.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Una. Una, I'm not really sure. Just to clarify a few things, I think they're maybe more constitutional rather than actually on immigration, which seems to be your specialist field. What is the fundamental difference between the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU rights? And how will the long-awaited EU accession, will that have any effect on the long term? And what exactly is that? I don't really understand what it is anyway, but will that affect the fact that we won't be part of the EU? it's just the difference between those. What's European rights and what are actually European conventions on human rights?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't speak to the European Ascension. That's not one I know too much about, but I'd be happy to double check it and get back to you to see if there's any specific impacts there. When I speak about EU rights versus the European Convention of Human Rights, European Convention of Human Rights, specific treaty, it's incorporated through the Human Rights Act. It deals with what we just commonly know as human rights, the right to life, the right to family life. But when I'm talking about EU rights and benefits, it's more things that have come through specific EU directives. So things like the right to work, the right to protection against discrimination in the workplace, the right to family reunion as an EU or the right to bring a family member with you as an EU national, the right to healthcare, reciprocal healthcare in another EU state. So they're things that have come through just sort of the functioning of the European Union rather than being specific human rights, if that makes sense. Now it's all linked, because when you look at things like workers' rights, there's always human rights impacts, there's always equality impacts that link in. But when we talk about EU rights and benefits, we really just mean the things, freedom of movement being the most obvious one, where you can move to any EU state. There won't be subject to immigration tax. You can work there, you can live there, you can bring your family there, your kids can go to school there. Those are all EU rights and benefits, which are it's just a slightly different thing than the specific European Convention of Human Rights. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And that European accession to the European Convention of Human Rights, I really don't understand that either. And obviously, I thought maybe you would have more insight, but I think it's more constitutional specialty that than immigration. But thank you.
Thanks, John. Councillor Donald Coffey.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and thank you, Una, for the presentation. I have 4 questions really, and you may not be able to address some of them. I don't know, but 2 of them relating to migration, so you might. Earlier on this evening, we saw a paper, and I had it confirmed by one of the officials that the Northern Ireland Protocol, the understanding of how that's going to be interwoven with future policies around some aspects of cross-border trade, is not really future-proofed. So, for example, it ensures an alignment to pre-existing EU directives and legislation, but it does not accord any commitment to their alignment with further or future regulations and directives from the EU. So now, obviously, they will be subject to a veto at Stormont. So the likelihood, I suspect, is, and I'm wondering if this is something you may agree with or appreciate, is that we will not only end up with potentially an east-west border, but also a north-south one, so the aspects of both. The second question is around, I know one of the councillors has mentioned the idea that we're going to have cheap imports, but my understanding is that by being tied to the EU market ourselves, we are much more likely to have imported inflation because of the intrusion of the east-west border controls on the sea will stimulate our further integration into all Ireland supply chains, which are obviously higher cost than those in Britain, and they're probably going to diversify far more. At the same time, as I know well as a trade unionist, our wages are tied to the lower and pegged to the lower end of those in the GB UK market. So again, we look to be squeezed in terms of living condition. I wonder if that's something you would agree with. Two questions on migration policy. The first is, I thought it was a recommendation by the Migration Advisory Committee for a number of occupations to go onto under the skilled worker route, meaning that you only had to be paid 20,000. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't catch that the British government had rejected those. You said that there was only going to be one, a uniform UK-wide policy. Now, my understanding, the MIC proposals, recommendations have gone to the Home Secretary. Maybe she's rejected them. I wasn't happy with them either, because it means that basically it was setting in stone that wage rates are lower in Northern Ireland than they are in GB, and not only that, they're very unrealistic. Hardly anyone that works, for example, in the likes of Moy Park, who's a migrant worker, would ever be paid 20,000 a year. So whether they'd make any difference at all is a moot point. Point 4 is really around the EU. I refer to them as concentration camps run by the EU in the likes of Moira in Greece, where they put non-EU citizens who clearly don't have access to so-called EU human rights. Will we see the establishment of similar camps potentially in Northern Ireland now that this becomes a frontier to the UK, or will we have something more like the direct provision that exists in the Republic? Thank you, Chair.
I don't know.
Okay, I'll maybe try and go backwards. There are some of the questions you've raised that I maybe won't be able to answer, but to start with the issue of usually asylum seekers being kept in camps and being kept in sort of in limbo in areas like Calais was one of the most famous ones. I don't see that occurring as a result of post-Brexit, us having that open border with the EU. But what we do already have is an immigration detention system, which is incredibly broad, incredibly open. I think we've the only indefinite detention in the EU. And there's one of those in Northern Ireland. It's called Larne House. And what we already see is people end up in that immigration detention centre in Northern Ireland frequently after they cross the border. We've heard of incidents where people cross the border by accident. They don't know, they don't realise, and they will be a legal resident in the Republic of Ireland. They'll have all of the visas they need for there. They'll be told that there's a really good shop, cross the border, travel to that, and end up encountering immigration enforcement, and they end up being detained in the UK. And what happens is they are sent to Larne House. Now, it's a temporary immigration detention centre. We don't have a long-term facility in Northern Ireland. So you're held there for a maximum of, I think, 7 days. If you're not released on immigration bail, or unless you're able to prove you hadn't entered the UK illegally in that time, usually what happens is people are transferred then to the permanent immigration detention centres in England, Scotland and Wales. Really classically, people here tend to get transferred to Dungavel in Scotland or Gatwick. And those immigration detention centres are, I mean, they're horrific. They're ripe with human rights abuses. I think some of you might have seen the documentary on Jarl's Wood that came out not too long ago. You know, that was an undercover expose of how people are treated in those detention centres, and they're really, really horrific. And really shockingly, what we've seen is that people who cross the border, particularly people who do so accidentally, and particularly people who have legal residence in, say, the Republic of Ireland, instead of a sort of pragmatic and sort of, I would say, fair approach being taken, where they should just be returned to where the place they have legal residence, sometimes they are actually returned. So they're sent from Larne House to an immigration detention centre in England, and then sometimes they're actually removed to their country of origin. So we've heard of people, you know, Filipino citizens being threatened with being returned to the Philippines when, you know, their home is in Dublin and they just happened to come up because they wanted to see the Titanic Museum, you know, and didn't know that they needed a visa. And that's something that's it's already such a they don't with in a sort of logical and sort of, I would say, human rights compliant way. My concern there would be that we might see an escalation of immigration detention practices in Northern Ireland, whether that would be provision of a long-term facility or just where they're going to rapidly move people through Larne House over to England, over to Scotland. I don't know. There's a really big movement at the minute. I say really big. It seems really big to me because I'm working with them, but there's a really strong sort of grassroots movement here in Belfast to try and get actually Larne House closed, to try and work to do alternatives to that kind of detention. So I think there would be a lot of resistance to that being expanded, but I think that's the likelier result. And whether that's better than a camp, it's probably just a different type of rights abuse. Sorry, I've forgotten all the other questions. In terms of the protocol, I mean, my understanding was the intention when, in those annexes, is that we were supposed to essentially keep pace. I'm not familiar with the details of it, so like I said, I'd be happy to, if you maybe want to send that through to me, and I can get one of my colleagues to come back to you on it. But it would be really concerning, because the whole point there is to put in secure protections, and it's just a further sort of undermining of the NI protocol. And then if you have the NI protocol is undermined, all of the rights protections, anything, the non-diminution principle, that's undermined as well. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the second question on immigration, if you could remind me.
It's about the Migration Advisory Committee's recommendations.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so yeah, you're completely right. There is a shortage occupation list, which works almost like a little point system, where if you meet certain things, you get money taken off. That standard, I think, is 25,600 at the minute, is what they settled on. But it's actually quite interesting, because the shortage occupation list was UK wide except for Scotland. And it is quite comical in a way, because some of the specific jobs that were listed for the shortage occupation list in Scotland included things like, a Gaelic secondary school teacher. So you can see that they were very unwilling to actually admit that there might be specific jobs and roles that devolved nations needed that are different from other parts of the UK. There's actually been some movement on that quite recently. So there's a new MAC report came out just last week that's recommended a further shortage occupation list. It's adding further jobs to it. And as a positive, this is the first time Northern Ireland will have specific shortage occupation roles. And I think that includes some agricultural roles. So that is, sorry, I was trying to think of positives earlier, but that has actually been quite a positive development to going towards addressing that one-size-fits-all system and the impacts of that.
Thanks.
Can I come back to that last point? Yeah, that's my whole. What I was really asking about was the latest report by the MAC actually brings forward a whole series of recommendations. Now, I'm not that happy with them, because it basically sets in stone the fact that Northern Ireland, it's okay to be an employer and exploit labour from outside of Northern Ireland if you are in certain sectors where you can get off with paying low wages to people. So obviously the solution to this is that increase the wages until, if you've got a shortage, let the wages be higher. So that's really, as a trade unionist, we're trying to raise wages as much as we can. And moreover, the proposal from the MAC is only for, I think it's for £20,480. Nobody in the likes of my park or any of these places where there is a labour shortage actually receives anything near that. And so it is meaningless as a concession. It's a concession that concretizes a two-tier labour market in Northern Ireland, falling further behind, and at the same time it doesn't even deliver, is my question really to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Donal, and thanks, Una. Next question is from Councillor Chris McCaffrey.
Gormil August, Caherly. Hope my internet's okay. I've just been having a couple of problems this evening as well. No, look, just a big thank you to Una for her presentation and for answering those questions. And I'm sure some of them maybe perhaps weren't just within their expertise, but I think I can speak on behalf of all the councillors when I have been impressed by her knowledge and expertise in this area. She had already sort of answered some of the queries I was considering raising, but there is one significant one that I suppose I would be concerned about, given the recent rhetoric on behalf of the British government. I know that the CAJ would have routinely submitted evidence to the European bodies in terms of human rights cases and so forth. So I was just kind of wondering, how effective and how helpful she would have found those European bodies, and what concerns that the CAJ may have in the future regarding the future relationship with the British government, considering the dishonourable way in which they've acted and the worrying rhetoric that they've been spouting over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've, as you said, CAJ has had very positive engagements with some of the European bodies, even sort of when we come to the Brexit negotiations, I've forgotten the name of it. Sorry, I think it's Task Force 50. But yeah, there was particularly at the start of the Brexit process, there was a lot of engagement there, and also more broadly, and with things like the Council of Ministers, things like that. There's been really, they're often very, they're often really good resources and vehicles for change. And yeah, I suppose there is a further concern of a lot there, where if you are losing some of the EU oversight mechanisms, if you're losing direct access to some of those bodies, that it might actually limit the ability to hold governments accountable, and push for rights protections. And also, a lot of the time, it's about having that outside body, having that sort of independent resource to go to on issues. And I think I already touched on this, but the feedback that I've been getting in any of our sort of networks, any of the meetings we've been in, particularly with the recent things like the Internal Markets Bill, the Overseas Operations Bill, it's just been that there's a real shock, I think. There was always concern about how the commitments made in, for example, the NI Protocol would be adhered to, but seeing the government stand up and say, we're going to breach international law, particularly because they chose the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to do that, it's really shaken trust. And I think a lot of organisations are now just they really want some kind of engagement. The thing that we keep hearing is they want to meet with ministers, where they want to speak to the UK government to get some kind of reassurance, some kind of engagement to show that it isn't as bad as it looks, that the commitments made will be adhered to, that there's not this rollback beginning, and unfortunately that hasn't really, as far as I can see, happened yet. All people can see is these very clear intentions to, particularly when it comes to the Human Rights Act, the European Convention on Human Rights, this intention explicitly said that they're rolling back on that, and because of that link with the NI Protocol, with the protections, with the things that people are relying on, there's just a serious damage to trust here. And I think what's really needed, and whether we'll get it, I'm not sure, but civic society, trade unions, business organisations, business representatives, there needs to be urgent engagement with them, and dialogue, and there needs to be that trust really needs to be rebuilt. I'm not sure that will happen, but yeah, it's been really significant impact, I think.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Una. So, Donald, do you want to take your hand down? And the last question I'm permitting tonight is from Councillor Deehan. Joe, do you want to go on ahead?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and my thanks also to Una for giving up her time this evening to take us through all of this important material. I want to, at this point, pay tribute to the CAJ for the important work that they do, and we have come to rely on them and the work that they do to ensure that our human rights and other rights are protected. Now, I don't want to rehearse matters that we've already raised, Chair, but Una referenced paragraph 52 commitments, and she mentioned the D'Souza case, and looked forward possibly to mechanisms to extend paragraph 52 provisions across the community. Chair, I suppose that, in the immediate aftermath of the UK leaving the EU, there was a rush to obtain Irish passports in the mistaken belief that if you held an Irish passport, that you would be afforded all those equal rights, opportunities and benefits of EU citizens. And that sadly has not proven to be the case, particularly given the priority that the EU puts on supporting the Good Friday Agreement. My question, Chair, in a nutshell is, if we are faced with a no deal if we leave the EU without an agreement, what implications, Chair, does Una see for extending those paragraph 52 commitments? Thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose the place to start is that we don't really have those paragraph 52 commitments. They were made sort of back in 2017 in the joint report, and there was, in that it said the phase 2 negotiations would bring forward mechanisms, so that people could access these rights. And then it never came around. It didn't. It hasn't been reflected in any. There's no binding agreement, as I said, relating to that in the withdrawal agreement. Even the NI protocol only refers to it in the non-binding preamble. And it seems instead that there was always this intention that those things would be dealt with later. And I think it's because so many of them are possibly, I'm trying to find a word for it, but they're chess pieces, they're bargaining chips almost, well, we'll provide the European health card if you do this. And I think that unfortunately that meant that no government wanted to necessarily write them in stone and set them out clearly, just in case there was some change to be made or some flexibility. And the problem is that we're now so close to the end of the transition period, and so many of those things, the AHIC card being the most obvious one, they haven't been clarified, they haven't been set out, and there's certainly no codified treaty or the only one we have is the Social Security Coordination Treaty. The only memorandum of understanding can be changed on the whim of either government. It's not a reliable. It literally says in its own paragraph that it is not a binding legal document, and that's really the problem there when we look at things like no deal. The Withdrawal Agreement Act meant that things like the EU Settlement Scheme, the Frontier Workers Scheme, those are now in law. There's a certain level of protection there. But when it comes to these sort of paragraph 52 commitments or things like the so-called common travel area rights, we don't have that equivalent. They're not secure, they're not codified. And that's where we're just so concerned about. The only thing holding a lot of those things up is EU law. And when it goes, that's when we'll start to see the gaps. And there's such practical things, you know better, this kind of committee would know better than anyone, things like cross-border healthcare, cross-border education. Those things they sound simple, but they're always more complex. And I think it was Centre for Cross-Border Studies, Project Border People, has tried to do a website where people can put in their citizenship, whether they're EU, whether they're British or Irish or anything else, what they're looking for, what rights they have a query about, and they're trying to create a system where that they can then answer those queries. And they said it's always been complex even before Brexit, and now it's proven impossible to create it because they simply don't have the answers. They can't tell people what their rights are. They can't tell them what to expect because we don't know. There's been no clarity from the governments. And actually, that's something I maybe should have touched on, that this is really impacting a lot of the advice-giving organisations, a lot of the frontline services who are trying to help people who are just trying to plan their lives, and they can't give any concrete, reliable advice because it's not being provided by either governments. So yeah, I think if we go into a no-deal Brexit, those things just become they go further, probably down the list of priorities, or potentially they become bargaining chips again. And it would really concern me that we just won't see them dealt with as quickly as they need to be.
Well, thank you for that, Chair. Thank you, Una. I guess if the British government can renege on international treaties, then they can also renege on memoranda of understanding, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Joe, and thank you, members, for the questions there. Can I, on behalf of Fermanagh Council, thank Una for her time this evening, for joining with this committee and for answering all the questions, for the breadth of knowledge that you've clearly shown, and we look forward to further engagement in the future. So thank you, Una, on behalf of the Council.
Thank you very much. And I'll pop my email into the chat. If there was any questions I wasn't able to answer or anything I missed out, please feel free to get in touch, and I can get back on any of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thanks for that. Moving on now, members, we'll go to matters arising from the last meeting from Monday the 15th of June, starting from page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7.
Yes, sorry, Chair, just in the top of page 7, we have 2 items of correspondence to draw to members' attention. The first, item 4.1, is a response from the Department for the Economy from the Minister regarding what direct financial interventions will be provided to the district. And members will have seen for the response that the Minister has indicated that the requirements around implementing the terms of the protocol lies mainly with the UK government, and that she was continuing to work on pressing the government to take on board the concerns of businesses and others. So it's really been probably little specific clarification, Chair, but referencing back to the New Decade, New Approach and the ongoing work of the Executive. You will have noticed as well, Chair, in the last paragraph, the Minister advises that if there are any specific concerns, either from members or from businesses, that we can share those directly with her.
Okay, thanks for that. I need to propose and second that.
I'll propose those, Paul.
Thank you, Catherine. Sorry, who was that second?
Josephine Deehan.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for that. Okay, moving on.
And Chair, just in the second recommendation, we also have a letter from HMRC, and this was regarding whether or not businesses here were eligible for this scheme, the 50 million support package scheme, and this letter states that they are eligible for application.
Okay, thanks for that. I have nobody indicating for questions, so can I get a propose for noting?
Proposed for noting, Chair, Victor.
Thanks, Victor. Somebody second.
Second.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Go with that one. Thank you. Moving on. And we're on page.
Chair, thank you. And just 2 further items in relation to page 8, Chair. The first, we have a letter from the Northern Ireland office, and this is related to the Council's request that the Northern Ireland office would consider the Fermanagh and Omagh district as the base for a permanent location, and reiterating the Council's view that there did require to be a permanent EU office in Northern Ireland. The letter responds to say that within the terms of the protocol, it's deemed that that is not required. And again, we have been invited to seek seek clarification from the Northern Ireland office or the protocol by way of writing. The second recommendation, Chair, on this page did relate to a meeting with the Northern Ireland office. We did make a number of requests, and the Northern Ireland office have indicated they would not be in a position to attend an informal meeting or at the Brexit Committee, and therefore any comments that the Council would wish to make should be made in writing instead.
Okay, thanks for that. I have no members indicating, so can I get a proposed and second to note that?
Councillor Armstrong, thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Sorry, who was that? Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Okay, moving on. So go now page 9 and proposing second.
We're okay, Chair.
We're okay on that. Okay, thanks for that. So moving on now to item 6 is to receive a verbal update on the current position in respect of Brexit. That's for the Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, really, I am mindful that Una made a couple of comments in her presentation as well regarding the current status, but perhaps just for information, members will be aware, on Friday of last week, the Prime Minister indicated that unless there was a fundamental change of approach by the EU, that Britain will leave the transition period on January the 1st without a trade deal. And there was subsequent communications today between the Prime Minister and Michel Barnier, and the EU side have indicated their intent and willingness to redouble their efforts to ensure that agreement can be reached. But certainly the understanding that we have, Chair, is that we should now be preparing formally for a no-deal exit of the United Kingdom at the end of the transition period. From a council perspective, Chair, we have continued to review and update our contingency plans, but it is very difficult in the absence of clear information. So really, there is very little more by way of an update that we have at this point in terms of the information that has been provided to us around planning. Members will be aware that certain provisions were detailed within the Northern Ireland Protocol, but obviously based on the Secretary of State's statement to the House on the 8th of September, it indicated that the government was intent to not necessarily adhere to the stipulations that had been provided for within the Northern Ireland Protocol. So our understanding, Chair, is that I suppose what happens next, that the UK haven't formally pulled out of the negotiations, so the redoubling of the effort presumably will be welcomed by all sides. In terms of Westminster, there will be a particular focus this week on the UK Internal Market Bill, and that will commence proceedings in the House of Lords. The second reading of that debate is due later today, or probably is commenced at this point. And the House of Lords European Union and Constitution Committees have also published reports into the bill and what they perceive to be the implications. I suppose just in terms of timeline, Chair, and it is significant, the House of Commons will rise at the end of this week for the November recess on the 23rd of October and is not due to reconvene until the 2nd of November. And as we understand it, the final European plenary session of the year will be held from the 14th to the 17th of December, and on the 31st of December, that is obviously the date in law for the end of the transition period.
Thank you for that. I have a question by Councillor Seamus Green.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to, well, first of all, I was listening to the news tonight, and Prime Minister Johnson had said that they'd pull away from the negotiations on Friday. Today, Mike, what do you call him, Gove, had said that they were back in negotiations, and then later on issued another statement that they were pulling away again. So even on ITV News tonight, by the political correspondent was baffled by what was actually going on. So they changed their mind 3 times within a matter of a couple of days. But anyway, given that we are, as a council, probably at the brunt of this changing of the NI protocol by the British government unilaterally breaking international law, and I'm no big believer in the British law system, but is there actually anything that we can do through our councils or like-minded councils to look at whether there's anything that can be done to try and protect us, as in taking the British government to court or get some kind of a review on their decision to do that? Because to actually break international law, surely they're breaking their own law as well. And I remember, I think there was about 2-3 years ago, they actually were brought to court on something they had did, and the court ruled against them and had to roll back. I think Paris was involved in that too. So is there anything, now it might be a shot in the dark now on it that I'm suggesting, but is there anything that we can possibly with other like-minded councils to try and protect ourselves against these lawbreakers in Westminster?
Thank you for that, Seamus. I'd share similar concerns. Alison?
Chair, we could certainly seek an opinion as to what scope or what options would be available to the council. I think one of the difficulties, and Councillor Green has alluded to it there is very little clarity about what the position actually is, and even some of the terminology around the breaking of the law was very, very caveated. But certainly we could seek an opinion as to what prospects we may have and what options would be available. And as Councillor suggested, we could certainly engage with other like-minded councils on the subject.
I would propose that.
Thanks for that, Seamus. I have a number of other members indicating here, so we'll go in order as they've come into me. Councillor Siobhan Curry.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, it's just on the back of Seamus there. Just in what you're saying there, even Alison, around us having no clarity, and it's hard not to think now that this is part of this whole game that the British government are playing, and we've just heard from Una very real concerns about actually playing with people's lives and their human rights. So even on those grounds, the fact, and Alison has just referenced their recesses in Westminster and recesses in Europe as well, given and we're supposed to deal with the fallout of this. So even on that basis, at the very least, is there not some legal mechanism that we would have that we're expected to try and cope with this? No clarity whatsoever with such a very short timeline now. Gormagget.
Thank you, Siobhan. Councillor Adam Gannon.
Thank you, Chair. I think Seamus raises a very good point there. The NI protocol was part of the withdrawal agreement, and I believe it was Article 4 of the treaty said that treaty takes legal precedence over anything in UK domestic law. And this internal market bill clearly is trying to overrule many parts of the NI protocol. And I'm just kind of sitting thinking to myself, I had the thought, surely they wouldn't be stupid enough to break international law and completely trashing their own chances of getting trade deals across the world, this big idea that they have. But then I realised who is actually in government, and they might actually be stupid enough to do it. So I think it's very important that we explore our options from a legal perspective anyway, as to what the cases are here if the internal market bill gets passed and that ministers in the UK decide that, they're going to follow it instead of the withdrawal agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Adam. Councillor Chris Smith.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose I'd like to register my dissent from any sort of idea that we're going to take on the UK government in some kind of far-flung legal fight. We've already engaged in, I think, two legal fights at the minute. I think people are very, very trigger happy to get involved in legal fights. That's one I don't see us having any chance of winning. I think it'd be farcical to even engage in it. So I'd like my dissent recorded, please, Chair.
Thank you for that, Chris. Councillor Anthony Feely.
So thank you, Gail. I'm not sure that anybody second Seamus' proposal. I was just going to second it, and I agree with himself at all.
No problem. Yeah, I haven't had a seconder, but that's now seconded. Thank you for that, Anthony. So moving on, Councillor Chris McCaffrey.
I was just coming in to do what Councillor Anthony Feely is after doing, but I do think Councillor Smith used the words farcical there, and look, I think what's farcical is that we've been put in this situation where we're only a matter of weeks away from the end of the transition period, and the British government have taken on this canis canem approach to their dealings and how they're treating all external governments and bodies and things like that. So I do think we should be exploring our options and protecting the interests of our people, our constituents and people in this district first.
Thank you for that, Chris. Okay, I have others there indicating Chris Smith, your hand's still up if you want to take that down. And Councillor Bert Wilson, your hand's up.
Yes, Chair. Well, I think Chris mightn't be so far wrong, because a lot of us wouldn't be so going to court if we were actually paying the bill. But the ratepayers that we represent out there will probably end up paying quite a few bills that they're not that happy with. So I would agree with our chairman. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bert. Okay, Councillor Earl Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Interesting debate as usual. I just want to put it on record that the Democratic Unionist Party grouping will show dissent on this one. We certainly will not be taking on that fight. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Earl. So I have nobody. Seamus, your hand's back up again.
Yeah, it's just interesting too for the great parties of law and order that claim to be that they don't want to take on the British government, who has openly said they're going to break the law. So it seems that if you're big and powerful, you can break the law as often as you want. But if you're the small man or something stealing apple, bang him up in jail. That seems to be the attitude. Don't take on the big and powerful.
Okay, thanks, Seamus. Okay, then that's confirmed, and we have recorded the dissenters so far. So moving on to the next item.
Chair, Alec Baird, I would be dissenting as well. We've in the past wasted a lot of time and effort and things, but I think this crowns it. So I would dissent as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Alex. Any other dissenters, if you can indicate now before we move on? That's Howard Thornton, Victor Warrington. Is that you putting the hand up to confirm your dissent in this?
Yes.
Councillor Diana Armstrong, yeah.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and Councillor Paul Robinson. We've got one from the Democratic Unionist Party grouping. So, okay, if you can take your hands down now, Seamus. Okay, well, the Chief Executive has indicated we're going to have to go to a vote due with the number of dissenters in this. So, yeah, we'll just do a roll call on this.
So, Chair, just to confirm, this is then to seek a legal opinion on the merits of the prospects for the Council to seek judicial measures against the apparent decision by the Government in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and to engage with other like-minded councils in such a mechanism. So, Councillor Armstrong.
Against.
Councillor Baird.
Against.
Councillor Blake.
For.
Councillor Buchanan. Apology, sorry, Chair.
Apology, Chair.
Councillor Campbell. Councillor Campbell.
Glenn. Okay.
Councillor Clark, I don't think is at the meeting, Chair. Councillor Coyle.
For.
Councillor Curry.
Ivaver, for.
Councillor Deehan.
For.
Councillor Anne-Marie Donnelly. Is absent, Chair. Councillor Sean Donnelly.
For.
Councillor Stephen Donnelly is an apology. Councillor Elliott.
Against.
Councillor Erskine.
Against.
Councillor Feely.
For.
Councillor Fitzgerald.
Avaver, for.
Councillor Gannon.
For.
Councillor Garrity.
For.
Councillor Green.
For.
Councillor Irvine. Councillor Irvine. Councillor Keenan.
For accountability and upholding justice.
Councillor Catherine Kelly.
For.
Councillor Podrigan Kelly. Councillor Podrigan Kelly.
I think it's had to leave early, Chief Executives.
Okay. Councillor Maguire.
Lahayan Malta for.
Councillor McAleer.
For.
Councillor McCaffrey.
Lahayan Malta for.
Councillor McCann. I think has left, Chair. Councillor McClockery.
You will see that there are
Against.
5.
Councillor McElduff is an apology. Councillor McPhillips.
For.
Councillor O'Coffey is gone, I think, Chair. Councillor O'Reilly, I don't think, joined the meeting.
Sorry, Alison, he did send apologies through the groups.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan.
Councillor Rainey. Councillor Rainey. Councillor Robinson.
Against.
Councillor Smith.
Against.
Councillor Swift. I think has left, Chair. Councillor Thompson.
Against.
Councillor Thornton.
Against.
Councillor Warrington.
Against.
And Councillor Wilson.
Against.
Chairman.
Oh, that's Councillor Campbell, Chair.
Glenn, yeah.
Apologies, I had an issue with my laptop. I'm for, Chairman.
Okay, thanks for that, Glenn.
Chair, can you go back to Councillor Rainey there? He is there according to that. He might be having problems.
Okay, Alan. Could he indicate in the chat? If he can't, if he could indicate in the chat.
I think he's okay now, Chair.
Against, am I?
Okay, thanks for that, Alan.
Okay, Chair. That is... It's 17 for and 12 against, so that's carried, Chair.
Okay, thanks for that.
And Chair, the only other item by way of update is that the committee, the executive committee, is considering evidence on Brexit and associated implications. So we have been invited to provide an update from the council perspective, and that will be on the Wednesday, the 4th of November. And I understand that's in virtual session. So it will be an opportunity to raise matters that the council has previously highlighted in writing to that committee around wider concerns.
Okay, thanks for that. I have some people indicating here with their hands up. Councillor Bert Wilson, you want to speak? Or is that up from previous? Okay, Glenn Campbell, your hands up. Glenn, are you with us? Your hand still up. If it's not to do with the question, if you could just put your hand down.
Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Adam Gannon.
If we need someone to propose that we attend that, I'm happy to propose, Chair.
Sorry, Chair, thank you. It's just for information, really. We have been given, the council had previously written for the opportunity to submit, so it's really following through. So I don't think we have a requirement at this point, but certainly we're happy to accept Councillor Gannon's proposal and then a seconder if you wish, Chair.
Okay, anybody to second that?
Seconded, Chair. Councillor
Thank
Gagan.
you. Thank you, Joe. Okay, Councillor Seamus Green.
The Chief Executive, how many's invited to that? I was going through the Belfast Brexit Committee minutes and I see that they have an officer and a councillor invited to it. I think it was the chair of the Brexit Committee was the one that was invited to it. So is that the same for all the councils? Is that the protocol we are following?
Well, Chair, we've been invited one officer and one councillor, and our normal approach would be if we get a single councillor invitation, it would be to the chair of the council and would work through accordingly. And the chair has indicated he's available to attend.
All right, Seamus.
I'm not so sure that whether the chair of the council represents the majority in this council area in his view. So I'm not particularly happy about that approach, to be honest.
All right. Well, Chris is indicating here to come in Chris?
Yeah, just I don't believe I have got a date for that yet, or have been consulted about my availability for that yet. But I'll come back to the chief executive tomorrow. Well, tomorrow. I'll come back to tomorrow to check I'm available.
That's fine. Sorry, Chair.
Can you clarify? Can that be clarified? Is that on the what protocol are we following that? Because Alpha City Council certainly isn't following that protocol.
Well, Chair, our normal position would be that if we receive a single councillor invitation, that would default to the chair of the council. Now, certainly the chair of the council has been copied in on the communications on this subject, and I understood had confirmed his availability. In the event the chair would not be available, it would go to the vice chair, and then we would work through the committee chairs. But certainly we wouldn't normally go to a committee chair ahead of the chair of the council.
Okay, and is that in standing orders?
Well, standing orders would govern the running of meetings, councillor, rather than the governance of the council, but the chair is the first citizen of the district. But it would also be reflective of the council's position. So it will be the council's position that is reflected, and that's obviously the basis of any submissions that we have made previously in relation to Brexit.
Okay. Chris Smith, your hand's up. Again, you want to come in here? No, it's gone down. Anthony Feely?
Well, happy to hear it, yeah. I'd be kind of coming in much the same as Seamus as well there. I know no harm to Chris Smith or the chair, Chris at all, sound fellow, but I would have, I think somebody as yourself, the chair of the Brexit Committee, be better going. That would be really fighting for issues on Brexit. You know, that's only my view on the table, not the same as Seamus said, but Alison has explained herself quite well. Okay.
Okay, thanks for that, Anthony. Councillor Bert Wilson?
Yes, Chair. Well, I think that it's a disgrace to see that is not allowed to voice his own opinion if he wants to, what he did tonight. But he is there to represent the council. And it's the first time I've ever heard anybody trying to knock a chair down if it was his position to go and represent the council. And but I wouldn't expect anything else, right? No, that's it.
Thanks, Bert. Seamus, your hand's still up. Do you want to come back in, or you want to put your hand down?
No, I have no problem if I'm the first who's ever done that, and as far as Bert's concerned. In fact, I'm quite happy with that. But my point is that this is a particular thing, and the majority of people in our district voted against Brexit. I believe Chris's party were against Brexit, and then subsequently went with Brexit after the vote was taken. So I'm quite within my rights to be concerned that somebody is going to represent the council who hasn't the views of the majority in the council with them. In my opinion, it doesn't make sense that. Maybe Chris can confirm that he's still an anti-Brexit as they were before the referendum. If that's the case, that's grand. But if he's now for it and going and representing our council to a meeting with the executive, I would have concerns that, and I think I'm quite entitled to have them concerns.
It looks to me as though the minority unionists are not wanted to be heard anywhere.
Bert, can you put it through the chair, please? Any discussion here is to go through the chair, so I'll just remind you that. Councillor Sean Donnelly.
Thank you, Chair. I would concur with everything that Seamus said. Chris is chairman of the council. He is a position, and as far as I'm aware, what Seamus has said there, they are pro-Brexit. Now, he's representing the council here, and the vast majority of us and the council don't want Brexit. So Chris is entitled to his own personal thing, you know what I mean? But when he's representing the council, he should be representing the views of the council. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, that's what's been indicated here, is that when Chris goes forward, he is representing the views of this council, as opposed to his own individual views, and that because as the first citizen of the district, then his position goes above that of what his own personal views might be. So would have full confidence now that when Chris goes forward with an officer present from the council, that he will respect the views of what the majority view in this council is. So
if that's the case, then I'm quite happy with him. But he would need to be representing the views of the council and in the area that he represents. So he's taking his own opinion, and the parties are taking their own opinion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. No, I think it's very important, and Chris would know that himself as he has taken on this role so diligently, that he would always be putting the role of the council first and foremost. So I'll bring that one. There's no need for any more discussion on that. Errol, your hand is up there.
Yeah, Chairman. I think Councillor Smith, who is the chairman of the council, it would be really breaking a tradition if he didn't ask the council chairman or the chairperson to take the lead in the first instance. He may have his own personal views, but he would be representing the corporate position of the council, as with the officer who would attend. So I don't think there's really a question mark about that. I'm sure there have been other chairpersons in the past that maybe not have been reflecting the views of other councils across Northern Ireland and have went to similar events. So I don't think that this discussion isn't really relevant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that, Errol. No, we're moving on from this. There's no need for any more discussion on it. We understand that when Chris goes forward, he will represent the views of the council as a whole, as a corporate body, and not that of his individual views. So moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 7, correspondence.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Chair, this is a response from still currently the Minister for Foreign Affairs, but no longer the Taoiseach. So this was a letter the Council had written, really seeking an urgent opportunity to meet with ideally the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach or relevant ministers in relation to the concerns over Brexit. Members will be aware from the correspondence of the letter issued in January, and we received the response in June. So just to highlight, Chair, that the response is very much referencing the language of the withdrawal agreement and the associated protocols. And obviously it was subsequent to that the statements were made regarding the intention to breach the document, the protocol that's referenced within this document.
Okay.
And in summary, there is nobody available to meet with the Council at this time, and the arrangements around engagement are detailed in the response.
Okay, I have one hand up, Councillor Alec Baird.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Did I hear Alison correctly say there that we wrote we wrote on January and we got a response in June?
Yes, Chair, that's correct.
I'm just thinking back to a discussion we had earlier in the disrespect of other departments for local government. It seems it's a sort of transnational thing now that councils are not given due respect. I think it's just very disappointing. I realise there's been an election in between times in era, but I think that really is. I had asked earlier, had we any examples of the time gone between a request and a response? I doubt if there's any of 6 months, but I'll leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Alex. Yeah, we had shared similar concerns when we seen the dates and how they corresponded. So we just need a proposing second to note that.
Propose to note, Tommy Maguire.
Thanks, Tommy.
Second, Alec Baird.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you. So that's it for correspondence. I have one item here for AOB, but before I get to that, we had agreed previously that these committee meetings would be bi-monthly, and unfortunately we weren't able to have the one in September due to a special council meeting of LDP. So, and in light of the current situation and the uncertainties regarding Brexit, I think if members would be happy enough to convene this meeting again in November, to see if anything may have changed at that stage. And so if
Proposed, Councillor Coyle.
Thanks, John.
Happy to second, Tommy Maguire.
Thank you, Tommy. So we'll agree to meet then in November.
That'll be the 16th, Chair, the Monday, the 16th of November.
Monday, the 16th of November. So thanks for that, Alison. So I have one bit of AOB that's been notified to me, and that's from Councillor Josephine Deehan. Joe?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to raise this urgent matter of any other business. Chair, you will be aware that on Friday the Executive announced a raft of measures to reduce the risk of spread of coronavirus, and within those recommendations came a recommendation from Minister Weir, Minister for Education, with the announcement that as from today, schools will be closed for 2 weeks. In other words, the midterm break has effectively been extended. And I quite recognise that these measures were designed to reduce the risk of spread of COVID-19. But one of the, I'm sure, unintended consequences of that decision was that in the situation where you have a playgroup or a childcare facility located within a school estate, then that facility would also close. Unfortunately, this has had major childcare implications for families. This is something that has occurred quite suddenly, and it has often not been possible for parents to arrange alternative childcare arrangements at short notice. In fact, some parents have had to take annual leave or unpaid leave to cover their childcare. I think that this is an unintended consequence. I can't think that these facilities would be responsible for increasing the spread of coronavirus any more than similar facilities located outside the school estate. So I would ask, Chair, for the support of this council to write to Minister Weir and also to the Executive Office, pointing out this anomaly and asking for it to be urgently reviewed and hopefully an exemption made in these cases. Chair, these arrangements are initially for 2 weeks, but given the current climate of uncertainty, we are not at all guaranteed that these restrictions may not be extended. So I would make that as a proposal, Chair, that we would write accordingly. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Joe. I have hands here. Alec Baird, is your hand up relating to this item? Alex, if you could take your hand down if it's not relating to what Josephine just said. Councillor Seamus Green.
Thank you, Chair. This is a matter that has been brought up to me of a local childcare centre that was placed in a school, and it's having to close, and it's having enormous consequences to the people, staff and people working in it, and to the families of the children that's going to it. So I would agree absolutely with Josephine that this is hopefully a non-intended consequence. But could I suggest, because of the way the thing works, and maybe with Josephine's permission too, that instead of us having to wait for this to be passed at council, which God knows when it will be passed at council, it will be next March before we finally get it. Would it be possible, what we have done at the Agriculture Liaison Group, to try and bypass this? We have, with agreement from the members, we have asked the chair of that committee to actually write as the chair of the committee, but almost as on a personal thing, but as chair of the committee, because this is so urgent. This almost needs to be written tonight and away tomorrow, or written tomorrow and away, because I don't think it's good enough, and I think it's having people's livelihoods and it's putting people's livelihoods at threat. And it's adding great suffering to people at a time when there's enough suffering, and I don't think this here is anything that couldn't be sorted with a stroke of a pen if the will was there, because as Josephine said, it is unintended consequences.
Thank you, Seamus. Alison?
Yeah, Chair, we have had instances in the past where there have been matters such as this that are strictly time-bound, and with the consensus of the committee, we proceed to action those immediately after the meeting, which would be tomorrow in this case, and it would appear, I'm sure there will be consensus for us to do that this evening, and we could proceed then to issue to the Executive Office who are coordinating arrangements, and also to the Minister of Education.
Okay, so if there's anybody who has dissent to that, going ahead and having the full support of... Sorry, Earl?
Sorry, my hand's up there, Chair. It's, I will not be dissenting on it. I just want to reassure Councillor Dehan. I'm sure she's got the same email as we got, the Omagh Town Councillors got over the weekend. And I was speaking to the person concerned today, and they have said this issue has now been resolved at a local level. So I don't know what Councillor Green's referring to, but certainly my information, it had been resolved over the weekend at an Omagh level.
Okay.
Thanks,
Earl.
Thank you.
Just to clarify that, Chair, this has happened. It's not just Omagh. This has happened. This has happened all over the north, and there's numerous childcare centres that has been, not just that one particular one. So those need urgent action.
Okay, thanks for that, Seamus. No, I don't have anybody indicating dissent to the letter being sent to the Minister for Education. So it's okay to proceed. I have Councillor Anthony Feely. Andy, you want in?
Yeah, I'll be brief, Paul. No, I was just coming in to saying that there's more than one childcare facility in the north. Like I've now getting issues about this as well. Like Omagh not the only place with childcare facilities. Okay, thank you, Paul.
Okay, thanks for that, Anthony. So if we can just ask Alex Bird, Seamus, and Anthony to take down your hands, please. So I have nothing else on the agenda for this evening, so we can bring this meeting to a close. So thank you everyone for your time, and that's about it. See you in November.
Thank you, Chair.
Slán Paul.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lonnie.